Welcome in, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Ellerts. I am the Visiting Associate Professor of Environmental and Energy Law Fellow here at GW, and we have a very special guest with us here today, Dr. Daniel Klem Jr. Dr. Klem is here to discuss his new book, Solid Air, Invisible Killer, Saving Billions of Birds from Windows. I just got my copy in the mail the other day. Dr. Klem is a United States ornithologist known for his pioneering research into the mortality of birds due to glass windows. He is currently a Sarkis Acopian Professor of Ornithology and Conservation Biology at Muhlenberg College. His research has influenced the design of buildings, not the least the Niagara Falls State Park Observation Tower, on which he was a design consultant. He holds several US patents relating to window design. He led and co-authored the scientific part of the Birds for Armenian project, whose principal goal was to use bird studies to promote environmental ethics and the preservation of natural lands in the Republic of Armenia. Most of his current research consists of using detailed observations and experiments to evaluate novel bird window collision, deterrent prototypes, preparing review papers describing the historic and latest means to save birds from windows, and serving as a technical consultant to glass manufacturers developing bird-safe sheet glass, various national and international conservation organizations, and local, regional, and federal government agencies. We here at GW are thrilled to have you, Professor. And before I turn things over to you, I would like to remind our audience to keep themselves muted. You're welcome to turn on your camera, and we will have a short Q&A after the presentation. So feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat, and we will try to get to those at the end. And I will now hand over things to Dr. Klem.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ellerts. I feel privileged as well to be able to speak to you all. So thanks for the opportunity. This topic is an important conservation issue for birds and people. And I hope by the end, at least, I will have convinced you if you aren't already convinced. What I plan to do is provide you with an overview of the topic in general, running through a series of slides, some I'm sure rather quickly, and then after which this summary, rather brief, is over. I'll go through the chapters of this book that has just come out, because it really is my latest attempt at educating the general public in hopes of gathering a critical mass of individuals so they can act and in turn stimulate the building industry to make the built environment that we humans live in safe for birds the world over. So here's some nice pictures of some beautiful birds. They're all victims of glass, sadly. There's a prairie warbler and a Baltimore oriole and an eastern bluebird, a common yellowthroat, and a yellow-throated warbler, and an indigo bunting. One of the things I do in my classes is that I like to point out that the students, even though they're being forced to take the bird class because it meets a science requirement, they should pay attention because they might learn something, that can win them a lot of money on a game show. For example, blues in birds are illusions. This is the result of structural colors. So your blue t-shirt is blue because of the dye, but the blue in the blue jay or the blue in the eastern bluebird or the indigo bunting is the result of reflection off the feather. Just like the sky is blue, it's not really blue, right? But it's scattered light, falls on our eye to perceive it as blue. So bird habitats in people's backyards are classic examples of attracting animals to these sites where, of course, homeowners have windows which we enjoy. Fatally painful, unfortunately for many. This is a yellow-throated vireo that happened to hit that window that you just witnessed. This is a layout of the birds that die like every fall or every spring in Toronto. An organization called Fatal Light Awareness Program, originally thinking that birds died at night, hitting buildings and then falling to the ground And later, I'd like to believe that I was party to helping them understand that most of the birds are dying during the daytime. They might be attracted under bad weather conditions to cities, but during the daytime, when they're in the canyons of glass and concrete, it's when they become vulnerable. And this is a rather dramatic display. In fact, this was so attractive, the National Geographic Society actually used this image in promotion of their magazine one year. So the sources of information from which I'm going to speak or try to attempt to convince you with some authority comes from research published in the literature, materials I found in museums, my own observations over now close to 5 decades, two sources of data which during my original comprehensive study took place over 1.5 and sometimes 2 years at residential homes, where the homeowners worked from home and they were able to document every strike, what happened to the victims, and record all kinds of valuable pieces of information, such as the orientation of the glass and all this kind of thing, weather conditions. And then, of course, there's a whole litany of experiments, which I have and others have conducted. Originally doing some flight cage studies, which is now typically known as tunnel testing, and field experiments that literally simulate and replicate what kind of results we can expect if a particular prototype to deter bird strikes were actually installed in real buildings. Estimates, in the 1990, I published a paper in which, and by the way, almost all, I think it's fair to claim, all of the results of my studies over these many years have been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So others have scrutinized my results and evaluated my interpretations. And I'm happy to say that a growing number of individual scientists, as well as others, are finding them compelling, enough so to enact change for the betterment and the safety of the bird life that we care about. So in 1990, the lowest estimate that I offered was 100 million birds annually dying in the United States alone. And, you know, when you listen to media sources, right, what do we hear about? As recently as just a week or so ago, the oil spills in California. But what about the Gulf oil spill that wasn't too long ago? And of course, the Exxon Valdez that occurred in 1989, estimated to kill some 290,000 birds. Well, this low ball figure of 100 million dying in the United States alone every year, that's equivalent to 333 Exxon Valdez's every year. And who's talking about windows? Practically nobody. It's a rare event that we hear media sources covering this rather tragic and alarming amount of death occurring within the bird population. And this represents about 12.5% of the birds in the world and about 30% of the birds in North America. We're talking about the different species. Now you'll see records. In fact, I just reviewed a document on best practices from the National Glass Association, in which they have a similar graphic design like this, and they have cats, you know, far exceeding what we see windows here. But the issue about cats and how much they kill is really a bit concerning, because first of all, the cat numbers are compromised because, again, I've published studies in which I've shown that it's not just cats and dogs, it's raccoons, it's skunks, it's even squirrels and chipmunks that learn that there are dead and dying individuals, prey, if you will, food, underneath the windows that are found in commercial and residential homes. And they regularly patrol those areas. And so animals that are first injured or debilitated by striking a window is taken by a cat. So the cat numbers really are compromised. They're compromised in inflating how much attrition independently is attributed to them. And then there's the common sense element that I like to point out, right? So cats are active predators, just like every other predator. They take the weak or the debilitated. They're hard pressed, and they're usually failing more times than not to capture their prey, and healthy animals invariably elude them. But the bottom line is that windows take the fittest members of the population as well as the unfit. They're indiscriminate killers. And if you think about it, again, common sense wise, there's astronomically more windows around the world than there are cats. And of course, these windows are passive killers, and wherever you look, and birds and glass are found together, you find avian mortality. So why don't we find, if all these animals are being killed, why don't we find them being taken away in dump trucks? And the answer to that is simply that they disappear. I personally have witnessed, doing seabird studies, flocks of hundreds of warblers and other small passerine birds flying into the ocean because they're just simply exhausted. And at the beginning of every breeding season, at least in North America, we estimate that there are about 10 billion birds, individuals. And at the end of the breeding season now, at this time of the year, that number has swelled to 20 billion. So between now and the springtime, 10 billion birds are going to be lost. Well, the principal cause of loss of many of these animals not only are problems along migratory travels or predators, it's the glass that, again, is an indiscriminate killer. So wherever you find them, you'll find victims. So why? Well, they're not telling us. It's one of my famous lines. You know, birds don't have the ability to inform us directly about what what causes them to kill themselves flying into these windows. But we study what physiologists and scientists studying the visual system of birds and other organisms can inform us about the details, their accoutrements, and we combine that with their behavior, and we can make some interpretations about what happens here. And basically, birds are deceived by glass. In the case of images like the above here, where it's a reflection of the facing habitat in sky, they're not able to determine that this is not real, and they fly into it. And when they see habitat on the other side of clear panes, they're not able to determine that either, and they strike the clear panes trying to reach the habitat seen on the other side. This is what happened. This is a perfectly clear pane of glass, but it covers a darkened interior, and as a result, it forms almost a perfect mirror on the outside. These kinds of illusions create a terrific hazard for these animals. So there's a series of slides just showing you some see-through effects, like in this corridor. Here's a reflective effect on some glass railings around a building. Plantings that are placed behind windows end up attracting animals. In the attempt to try to get to them, they end up getting whacked and killed. What happens when this occurs? Well, if we humans are in a very bad accident on the highway and we smash our heads, and we're fortunate enough to have the helicopter show up, the medevac, take us to the hospital, what they'll do is they'll cut the top of your skull off while your brain swells. And then as it recedes, the edema goes away, they'll suture you back up and you'll survive. But if you're not in the hospital in time, the blood-brain barrier will do you in. And consequently, this is what happens with birds. They strike with their head most often. Your brain, if nobody ever shared this with you, is about the consistency of a banana. So if you try to squeeze a banana, you'd find out what the tissue is like, and it gets traumatized. And the skull, of course, keeps it internally squashed against one side. And then when it tries to recover through swelling and other responses, it again breaks the blood-brain barrier. And so you can see here, this is actual skeletal fractures are pretty rare in collisions, but this is a rather dramatic example. This is an ovenbird, a small warbler, where the upper and lower mandibles were broken as it hit. And these are a series of white-crowned sparrows showing various levels of internal hemorrhaging in the blood from nothing. And they all died outright striking a window. So predators, again, as I said earlier, take the unwary, the lesser fit individuals of populations. But glass takes the strongest as well as the weakest. And that's what makes it an insidious, harmful, debilitating population attrition for the health of a species. Conservationists will always tell you that the time to save a species is when it is abundant, not when it becomes rare and endangered. And so we need to address this issue that's affecting both the common and abundant as well as the rare and threatened species if we're going to save our birds the birds on our planet. Here's just some examples of a tiny window that ends up killing birds regularly. This window you saw earlier where you have various animals for flight paths. Turns out when you do these studies and these monitorings that have taken place over all these years, there's no time of day, there's no weather condition, there's no a season of the year that birds elude the window hazard. Lethal strikes occur more frequently, and at least they're documented in urban areas because reporters live there and people turn them in. But really, this is less than 1% of all the birds that die on these tremendous. Just a few weeks ago, there was a big kill, a couple hundred birds in New York City that got publicity in the eastern part of the US. So these mass mortality factors, another thing too is that I would never want to deter people from being enthusiastic about encouraging city planners and building managers to turn their lights off at night. But the nighttime issue is really one of a rather rare, relatively rare event. When the cloud cover is low and birds are forced to fly below, say, 2,500 feet, they come within the reach of lights of cities. And this is what draws them in like moths to a flame. And on those nights when the weather condition forces those birds to fly lower because of low ceiling and their influence, they really are attracted to the skyscrapers, but they swirl around. Very rarely are they actually hit the skyscrapers. They become exhausted and confused. If anything, they have just as much danger hitting each other rather than the building itself. They flutter to the ground. Now, again, as I said earlier, they're in the canyon of concrete and glass, and that's when they get deceived, and that's when they get killed. Homes attract lots of birds, especially for those that feed them. And it's at our homes around our country where most of the deaths are occurring. People will tell you it never happens at my house. Well, it does. And there hasn't been a home that I've ever visited that I haven't checked the windows out that I was able to find evidence that a bird strike occurred. So the bumps, as I write in the book, that one hears are not really the ghosts that are showing up in your home, but rather a bird likely to have struck your window. Solutions come in short and long term. What I refer to the short-term solution is having to retrofit existing windows because they're killing birds the world over, and we have to do something about that. And long-term solutions are producing bird-safe glass that can be used in remodeling and new construction. So physical barriers could keep birds from flying in. My research has shown what it takes spacing-wise to place elements uniformly covering a window so that the bird will be able to recognize it as a barrier and avoid it. And that's what we call the 2x4 rule. So you need to typically separate elements, whether they be lines or dots or spots or diamonds, by 2 inches if they're patterned in horizontal rows, and by 4 inches if they're patterned in vertical columns. These spacings have been shown to transform the space that a window occupies into a barrier that a bird will see and avoid. And lately, many researchers and other conservationists have pointing out we can modify this rule to make it a 2x2 rule because shorter spacing, even in the vertical direction of columns, will save smaller species more often, like hummingbirds and kinglets and animals of this level. Architects number windows from surface number 1 on the outside facing the environment, and then the inside of that pane is 2, and if there's another pane, it's 3 and 4, and so on. Well, it's so very important to place your elements on surface number 1, especially if you're dealing with a reflective window, because if you place any kind of deterrent effect to alert the bird to the danger on any of the inner surfaces, they can be hidden. They can be not available for the bird to see and avoid. So surface number 1 becomes very effective. And again, if you never really thought about that, just like that window I showed you earlier that was crystal clear, but covering a darkened space and forming like a mirror, right? Almost 99% of most windows installed in buildings have a reflective effect. And that's where most of the kills are occurring. It's the atria, it's the corridors, it's the railings that are clear around some buildings that create the see-through effect. And then they're just as lethal, but just so happens that there's not as many of them in the world's built environment. So there are these cords referred to as Acopian bird savers that can be purchased, or they're easy to make on your own, and you can hang them. The manufacturer of these, or the inventor of these, seems to think that they're so beautiful and attractive that everybody's going to be fighting to put them up on their windows. I haven't really found that to be the case, but if you have some tolerance for protecting animals, this is a cheap and easy way to do it. And if it's acceptable to you, I highly recommend it. There are films. Kaleidoscape is one. You can find this on Amazon. It's a one-way film. 3M makes this film, and they don't sell it for the purpose of bird safety, but they'll sell it to other manufacturers who in turn sell it for bird safety. And this is an image of looking at this window from the outside, right? And this kind of film is used on buses for advertising and things of this nature. And so 3M sells it to advertisers that typically last a couple of months to weeks, and then they take it off and have a new advertisement on the bus. But it can be used and last quite a long time. Such film has been put on the Toronto Zoo and it's been in place for over 12 years, and it's still very effective and functioning. This is what it looks like from the inside. You don't see any of these patternings, right? So it's like you're in the bus. If you're in the bus and you're looking out the window, you don't see the advertisement on the outside. And then you have tapes. The American Birding Conservancy it used to sell this tape. I don't think it does now, but it's thinking about developing more tape to be sold for the same purpose. And similar effects can be obtained using films that can apply dots or lines directly. And this is a group called Feather Friendly. It's a subsidy of a bigger corporation in Toronto called the Convenience Group. But all of these are available, easily found with a Google search, like everything else in life is these days. Acid etch is a way in which you can create patterns on windows. This is becoming more acceptable. These are patterns that are visible to both humans as well as birds. And acid etch patterns, as well as frit patterns, give our human eye a frosted effect, right? So these are very appropriate and relevant for remodeling and new construction. This is novel glass that can save birds from the beginning. This is on our campus. This is a fritted pattern. When you look at it from a distance, you can see through it. If you're up next to it, it becomes a bit formidable to try to look through, but just step back a foot or so and you can get through it. So if these kinds of deterrents are acceptable to you, or the developer, the architect, then they're functional, they work, and we highly encourage them. Angled glass was once thought to be a sort of a very good solution. And the reason was thought that, like this, if it reflects the ground, you'd predict that birds would less likely to fly into the ground than they would into the facing habitat and sky. But it turns out that this actually does protect birds from strikes and injury. But the reason it does it is because they don't hit with as much momentum. They deflect the momentum, and so they survive. It isn't because they're not likely to fly into the ground, which many birds actually do fly to perch on the ground and so on. This was a picture I took in Vienna when I was invited to give a talk when I was doing the Armenian project. And I went out the city because I had heard that they had these noise barriers and they were all clear. And they put these silhouettes. One or two silhouettes really doesn't work. So you need to uniformly cover this with silhouettes that are separated by the 2x4 or the 2x2 rule to be effective. There are decals which you'll find on the internet, some purporting to use ultraviolet signals. It's sort of a moot point because this is a frosted effect and birds see it as well as we do. But the spacing is so very important here. The distance at which these decals are recommended to put on windows really causes still a great deal of mortality. And so putting them on in such numbers that they're separated by the 2x4 inch rule will make them effective. But people are many times reluctant to do that because it blocks out a good portion of their windows. Bird feeders, placing them, this sounds counterintuitive, but putting them closer to the window, the better it is for the birds because they come and go and they don't build up enough momentum to hurt themselves. A bird only needs to be about 1 meter away, a little over 3 feet before it can leave a perch like a sparrow or a tiny insect eater like a vireo or a warbler and build up enough momentum to kill itself outright. So moving the feeders so they're closer to the glass surface protects them because they can't build up that momentum and they come and go concentrating on the feeder. And this is an experiment which I conducted which shows the increase. One paper years ago described Klem's density theory as being disproved according to them. And I was sort of surprised because I didn't think I certainly didn't ever write a formal density theory, but what the author was describing was that they took stock, they took a survey of the birds 100 meters away from the window, and found that that data really didn't correlate with the number of birds that were being killed at the window 100 meters away. And when I talk about the immediate vicinity of windows or the danger zone, like here, I'm talking about 10 meters, I'm talking about 30 feet, because that's the area, if the animals enter, they're in a position to be deceived by the glass. So the elegant solution that I've written about is using ultraviolet signals. I learned about this in the 1970s, but couldn't really test it until the 2000s because all glass is really coated with material to absorb ultraviolet, so it doesn't fade your rugs or your curtains, or it. And that's why your eyeglasses have coatings on them to protect your eyes from ultraviolet. It can be harmful, and so living things can't detect absorbing wavelengths. They have to reflect. And so there was nothing that I could test that was reflective. And that changed when I met a manufacturer who was able to produce a prototype for me. And I was able to tell that you could have a wavelength from 300 to 400 nanometers having a power of reflection of 20 to 40% over this range and produce an effective signal. And this is what an ultraviolet camera shows when the patterning is taken in direct sunlight, because the sunlight is reflecting back the ultraviolet. And this is what it looks like in the shade. And in both cases, these were effective deterrents. So that's a quick overview. And if you can bear with me, I'll again quickly go through my my little book chapters, highlighting some of what I've already shared with you, but doing it in, again, abbreviated fashion. So this book was written for every citizen on the planet. And my hope is that enough people will read this and be convinced that this is such a serious environmental issue, important to birds and people, that they'll act. They'll talk to their legislatures. They'll encourage their zoning planners and their ordinances in their communities to have architects and developers build responsible buildings that won't be killing these large numbers of human beings. So the goal is, again, we'll have to wait and see, but the goal is to capture these citizens and make them a meaningful force to change the way our built environment looks to these animals and protect them. These particular pictures, they're in my book, but they happen to be the place where I first witnessed and documented my observation of the very first window kill. This was in 1974. It was January. And like everybody else, I'd never heard of birds flying into windows. And I went there, I sat on a bench, and early in the morning, a bird came flying through and smacked into this building right here at the top and killed itself outright. And then I went looking around my university campus, which happens to be in Southern Illinois, and the very bottom of the state, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. There's two Southern Illinois universities. One campus is in Edwardsville up near St. Louis, and this one is the larger one with the medical school and law schools and so on. And this was a chemistry building, and it was a big killer of birds. So I started, when I discovered this issue, it was part of my doctoral dissertation, it was my doctoral research, and I've been doing it for 47 years. Almost a half a century. It's hard to imagine. And when I completed my dissertation in 1979, I really thought the major scientific journals were going to be fighting for this novel and interesting new discovery about the mortality of birds. It took me almost 10 years to convince the leading editors of the scientific journals to publish my work. It was a shock to me. And I'm still, and I highlight this in one of the chapters about the struggle of getting the word out, which is a chapter 8, I think it is. But for me, this first comprehensive study began from 1974 and completed in 1979. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that I've been, in addition to convincing those editors to publish my work, I've been attracting younger scientists. And ever since the early days up till today, more and more scientists are turning their attention to this conservation issue and doing their own studies. And I like to point out, look at what happens in the scientific community when somebody builds, for example, a better mousetrap. The person who built the first one is sort of forgotten. But I'm happy to report that all of these young people that are doing this new and innovative work, studying birds and the threat that windows pose for them, they haven't really produced anything novel or shown that my fundamental conclusions and my results are different from those early conservation and comprehensive study that took place in the 70s. So birds are still deceived. They still act as if glass is invisible to them. The attractants that bring them to the vicinity within that 10-meter killing zone is still been supported and validated by study after study after study. So glass was originally manufactured and used in human dwellings about 290 years current era, and it's become progressively more important, and it's a relatively cheap material that's used throughout the world. Every year, about the surface area of the state of Delaware, glass is produced and used, and it's just as lethal wherever it occurs for birds. Birds behave again as if they don't see the glass, and I described that earlier. Here again, the estimates that are occurring. One little trick of the trade, so to speak, in addition to trying to get sound bites to get media people and news people interested, is this now current levels of depiction of kills are 365 to a billion birds a year die in the United States alone from windows. And this comes from a study by Scott Loss and his colleagues. Dr. Loss is at Oklahoma State University. Another way of looking at it is the lowest figure of 365 is like 1 million birds die a day around our country. And it's all seasons of the year, year round. So it really is a tragic preliminary major avian mortality factor. And a study that was published in 2019, published in, again, our most prestigious science, one that, turned me down to produce my paper in their journal, was published with a host of authors showing that 3 billion individual birds have been lost to the North American population since 1970. And mercifully, they were attentive to the attrition attributable to windows, and that's one of the principal mortality factors that they describe. Here in chapter 4 of the book, I talk about the evidence. What did I learn from all those observations and all those individual homes that I monitored? Well, for example, birds were hypothesized to get killed more often at north-facing windows when they were migrating south in the fall, and south-facing windows when they were migrating north in the spring. That doesn't occur. Windows are just as lethal no matter what direction they face in. And we know this because these birds that are migrating characteristically at night and spending the day in and around resting and feeding, they can find themselves at any window facing direction and be deceived and die flying into it. So experiments revealed, both in these flight cages as well as in the field experiments, that glass literally is invisible to birds. In fact, one of the very early experiments I did in my flight cage experiments, again, what's called tunnel testing today, was that I asked the question, can a bird really tell the difference between clear airspace and clear glass? And the answer was no. So I took out the glass so I wouldn't harm the birds when they were flying in the tunnels in the flight cages. And then I was able to hang various deterrent methods on other sides and ask the question what did I need to do to obstruct that side so the bird would avoid it. And that's where the 2x4 and the 2x2 rule came into effect. Here again, this is what I showed you before about how the trauma occurs, but you didn't see this in the last one. This is a histological study of what happens when the blood-brain barrier is broken. This is a pool of blood between the cerebellum. And if you ever watched a bird that hit a window and is trying to recover, it's opening and closing its mouth, it's struggling to survive. And it's this paralysis that results from this kind of injury internally. Valuing the dead. This is a chapter where I talk about, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a legion of people that use bird banding so that we can put bracelets on birds. And when they show up on non-breeding grounds and breeding grounds, that we can try to ascertain how they got there. What was their flight paths and so on. And I would argue, they get about 4 to as much as 6% return on those bans, which is practically nothing. But if people just paid attention to who's getting killed at windows, we would learn an awful lot, specifically about migratory routes. For example, when I wrote about Chicago and a lot of death that occurred at the convention center there at McCormick Place, but I only had a chance to visit there for the first time in about 2005. And what I marveled at from my host who took me around the city to see and witness window strikes was the amount of brown creepers and Lincoln sparrows that died in huge numbers. Those birds occur in the eastern part of the United States, but they're sort of rare visitors for us, and we're always excited when we see them. But out there, they were being killed sort of hand over fist, sadly, at the windows. One of the two things, like historically, there's this very famous endangered species of ours called the Kirtland's warbler. It breeds in the upper part of Michigan, and it travels, we now know today, it was discovered to the Bahamas for their non-breeding grounds, right? But before we knew where their non-breeding grounds were, which was quite a while, if you would have paid attention to birds being killed at windows in Ohio, and you took a straight edge and you put it from their breeding grounds through the Ohio window kill site, you'd take you right to the Bahamas, and it would have alerted researchers to look there to begin with. And another paying attention to window kills dramatic event was the discovery of the white-bellied emerald for the very first time in El Salvador. It was found killed at a window in the city of El Salvador, San Salvador in the capital. So the paying attention to the specimens, using the specimens, that have died for looking at structure and function and other anatomical features or physiological events that would lead us to learn more about their lives are all possibilities for paying attention to this carnage that's taking place and trying to learn as much as we can, even though we're not willing to stop it. In chapter 7, I talk about the value of birds. Our government publishes a report about every 6 years, and it turns out that what always wins out as being identified with what most human beings will pay for a hobby or an avocation. Gardening. Gardening does it every time. What's number 2? Bird watching, birds. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry just in birdseed alone. But birds also help with dealing with pest control, pollination. There's a whole host, and I talk about those kind of values, not the least of which are cultural symbols, right? Don't we know that doves are peaceful symbols? Well, biologically, if you really know much about dove behavior, you'd find out that, sorry. They're really, they're at each other all the time, and there's very little peacefulness about doves, but that's okay. Still, they're symbols, right? And they also have effects of religious symbols. So birds, from the time humans have recorded anything, birds have played a major role. And we owe it. We owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our children to make sure that our culture and our lives, the world over, continues to respect and enjoy birds. And so this chapter talks about that and tries to convince you. This chapter, I was happy to see that one of my reviewers pointed out that, if you get Klem's book, you might be tempted to turn to the chapter 9 on solutions. But don't do that. Read about chapter 8. Read about what happens to the evolution of awareness on this topic over time, and how he struggled in the beginning with editors and his own scientific colleagues, and how slowly but surely inspiring things are happening more so now. So the book, I hope, comes out at a good time where people are receptive and they'll be able to do things. But in here, quantitative studies by myself and others, injuries, what elements of the environment are important to help us predict where more kills will occur, how to prevent them, and of course, review articles that I and others have been attempting to write to convince people that this is a serious issue. Solutions, right? The 2x4 rule, we talked about this before. And of course, ultraviolet signals as what I call the elegant solution is still a work in progress and continues. But there are products available that use ultraviolet signals already from glass manufacturers. This chapter probably is most relevant for this audience. What's the story about legal protection of birds? Well, we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which just had its 100th anniversary. in 2018. But it turns out that that act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and many regional legislation to help protect birds are confused with the prospects that litigation might somehow damage the use of those acts by certain government agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and others. If a court case, for example, might find that the legislation is inappropriate. So these acts have largely been used by our government to, I don't want to say threaten, but encourage, like wind industry with so that the wind turbines don't kill birds, or the power industry so that the eagles don't die shorting themselves out on power poles. But the window issue, since everybody is guilty, it's hard to imagine that this can be really enacted. Every citizen who owns a home or has a property or is involved in responsibility for a building that has a window in it is culpable and guilty of these violations. And so enforcement seems almost out of control. I've always written in the past in some other articles saying, okay, let's not arrest every citizen. I would have to be arrested as well. But what about places like McCormick Place that kill 200 birds a day? Don't you think we should be doing something about that? Well, it turns out that the laws are really been focused more on municipalities and local areas. That's gaining some traction today. We still have the prospect of doing good legal things. For example, the Canadians have been a bit more courageous than we US citizens. They've used their equivalent to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to take companies to court. And I've served as a witness, an expert witness in some of those trials. And they've had a bit of success there. And one of the groups that sponsors this is a group of attorneys called Eco Justice. And our equivalent to this, as best I can tell, is Earth Justice in the United States. And I've done everything in my power to try to convince anybody on their staff to even contact me or talk to me. And I never get any replies. Just seems to be no interest. And if I can gather from this consequence, it's that, again, perhaps the legal community is a little reluctant to use these laws to bring litigation for fear that it might harm the very good parts of the law that's being used by the government today through some of these, threats of bringing legal action. In this chapter, I give an example of a letter, for example, that you could write to an architect or a developer or a legislator, encouraging them, telling them about the problem, and asking them to use their influence to protect the birds. I also give in this chapter an example of an ordinance that could be written by a municipality that would help. So these are utilitarian things that are used as examples to try to encourage. And I'm sure there are better, more articulate and talented people than myself that could craft similar letters or similar ordinances that would be as effective. But this is a start, right? So take a look at that. Maybe that would be helpful. And finally, the final chapter, I'm trying to point out, we have to preserve these birds, not only for our own utility and enjoyment, but also for our children. And one of the technical reviewers that I studied, that read over my early manuscript, recommended that I had to come up with some kind of ending, right? That would capture the interest. I'm not sure I did that, but this is my rendition of that. And that is like, pretend that you know a population that's extremely vulnerable and members of that population are dying. The strong leaders, as well as the regular citizens, they're perishing. And the people in the community, they can't really understand what's going on. So now an alien visitor comes to interact with them, and they can immediately see what's happening. They can see the force, what's happening, and they can correct it. And so I end in this chapter by saying, think about windows as the lethal force, taking the strong as well as the weak. And think about humans as being able to identify it and eliminate that force. Remember, these birds are innocent victims. They have no voice. They can't speak for themselves. We need to do that for them. And that's what's at the heart of trying to wrap this up and point out to people that there's rationale and justification for their help. The other thing I end this chapter with is optimism, right? Hope. Think about it. This is not an issue like climate change that is unbelievably complex. It needs a whole litany of constituencies to work together to save our planet. Here's something we can solve. We can solve this tomorrow. We just need the will and to act. And so that's what the book's about. I hope that message, in addition to my explaining it to you, comes across without me having to explain it to you. So thanks a lot. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Klem, for your presentation.
Yeah.
We will now transfer to the question and answer portion of today. So if you have any questions, feel free to, if you're on Zoom, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. You can ask your question directly, or you can drop any questions into the chat that you may have, and hopefully we'll get to them all. I'll take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. I'm very interested in reading chapter 11, where you talk about advocacy. I was wondering what advice you would give to attorneys who are often at these land use meetings, city council meetings, involved in permitting new buildings. What advice would you give to them to strongly advocate that for environmental protections and for protecting windows and implementing some of these devices you mentioned?
Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind is to have them be aware of this issue and bring it up in the first place. It's surprising to me, just like, when I travel around the country and I learn about a new school that I never heard of before, it surprises me. Why didn't I know that? This is a topic that should be on tip of everybody's tongue that's interested in conservation, and especially for the protection of birds. But I'm always marvel at how ignorant, even the people should know, architects and developers. And so if you're in a meeting where these people are gathered for the very purpose of talking about of building, this should be a topic that's brought up. And the next question should be, what are you doing about it? And if nothing, the attorney or anybody involved in this issue can provide resources. Again, this is not a secret, it's available, right? And they could come even with a little file card to point out. And like, as I said earlier, everything's a Google away these days. You can find a litany of sources to help guide you. And there are guidance, the American Birding Conservancy has building guidelines. The Toronto people have building guidelines. Calgary, across the country, several individual municipalities have produced actual guidelines for building and recommendations. And most recently, in 2019, the Canadian Standard Association was given a grant from the Canadian government to come up with the best practices, a listing, and that's available. And that's been used around the world already since 2019 to help guide and alert and inform and like 2x4 rule and so on. So yeah, just bringing it up will be helpful.
Thanks. I have one question here in the chat that I see, and that's about what advice would you give to attorneys who may not have a strong science background? Environmental attorneys sometimes major in philosophy or other things and may not have a strong biology background or other things like that.
Well, I really don't think that's an impediment at all. First of all, you guys, if I can tell anything about your education, just from the outside looking in, you're got your nose and your eyes in law books, from the day you enter school and long after you leave. And every attorney's office I've ever been in, I've seen these bookshelves filled. So I know you know how to read. And there's not complicated stuff. Like, self-serving here, read my book, you'll get what you need to know. But really, like Dr. Fauci's talking about our virus thing. What's he always, it's sort of, I cringe a bit, he's talking about data. Why doesn't he just use a simple term like evidence? This evidence is easily available. We know that birds are deceived. This glass is invisible to them. And so these fundamental pieces of evidence are easily captured and easily explained. And really, anyone can do it. And I think an attorney would find no trouble whatsoever cobbling together a handful of principles that would help explain to anybody else, whether another peer or whether they're clients or whether it's the building committees and so on, all of these things, it's not beyond anyone's reach, really.
Professor Herman Walker, did you have a question? I see you're unmuted. I don't know if you unmuted yourself to ask a question or.
Oh, I'm mainly unmuted just to say this is a fabulous talk, and I just really appreciate it, Dr. Klem. I don't have any technical questions to ask you, but I am really interested in those guidelines that Canada came up with, and we'll try to get a copy of them. I was also reflecting on how many other threats threaten birds these days. And the collisions are way at the top, the collisions with buildings, basically glass. But so many other threats that, it's really a crisis.
Oh, it is. And here's the deal, I mean, I point out in the book, I'm not arguing that we should be looking at windows and not be concerned about domestic cats or wind turbines or anything else. We humans have the responsibility to address all of them, like you said. And by the way, while I'm thinking of it, it turns out that the Canadian Standard Association, if you go directly to their website, they will require you to pay for that document. But there are several, there's this convenience group that I mentioned in my talk, this Canadian that produces this films, they have purchased the authorization to be able to distribute that free.
Oh,
So if you go to their website, I think you'll find a free copy of that Canadian Standard Association available to you.
well, that's great, especially for our students.
Yeah, for sure.
Dr. Klem, we have a question here. Are there differences between bird species that some are more susceptible than others?
That's a good question, of course. And by the way, my wife pointed this out to me. She noticed that when we watch, news occasionally and somebody's being interviewed, almost everybody starts off with, gee, that was a good question. Well, anyway, of course, they're all good questions. Here's the deal. I argue, just because of the visual system and the behavior of birds, that every one of the 10,500 species of birds in the world today that we estimate are vulnerable. They're all vulnerable. But for sure, some are far more vulnerable than others, just because of their presence in and around human dwellings, right? One sort of counterintuitive thing is that for sure, house sparrows and rock pigeons, right, our basic city pigeons, they show up on the dead list. They get killed flying in, but proportionately, an unbelievably small number of them. And my interpretation of the reason why they have this kind of immunity is because they're flying to the sills and the ivy that are near the windows, right? And this offers them behaviorally protection so they don't injure themselves as much. I have a little anecdote in the book about a colleague of mine that worked at the University of Kansas, and they built a museum where the windows were recessed. So these rock pigeons were being killed in large numbers because they were interpreting these recessed parts of the building as sort of a cave, and they would fly into it and they get whacked, on the inside. So in the book too, I also describe how yellow-billed cuckoos, whose numbers are declining greatly, there's a list of a number of research papers, my own included, that point out how yellow-billed cuckoos seem to be extremely vulnerable to windows. And there's a whole host of others that, like the thrushes and the robins, especially the thrushes, like the wood thrushes and the Swainson's thrushes, whose habits are to fly within the aisleways of vegetation. And when they're reflected in windows, and grouse do the same thing, they end up getting killed, more frequently. So yeah, there's a big range, and in my publications and in this book, I point out what are the ones that get killed more often when you're monitoring a building and so on. And you'll see things like the sparrows and the juncos and so on. They're high on the list, as are American robins and some of these other thrushes. Yeah, for sure. Some species are especially more vulnerable. Cedar waxwings, being attracted to a fruit tree near a building. One little vignette I always like to point out, a colleague of mine worked at the Smithsonian, and they were building, another big structure on the mall. And when he would get off of the metro and walk to his office, they were a big wall of glass, and he would pick up the birds that had flown into it almost randomly along his trek. And then they planted maple trees, like every 10 feet in front of the building, right? To beautify it and make it look. And then he only found the birds where the maple trees were. And again, I'd like to think that they would say ornithologist instead of, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on. But here the birds were coming to the maple, right? They had to see the reflection. There was another maple tree right in front of them. They tried to get to it and they got killed flying into it. So anytime you have vegetation or water or some attractant that can explain why one species or another is entering that danger zone, you're in a position to predict that that particular species is going to show up on the dead list more often than another.
Well, I see that we are unfortunately out of time, so I would like to thank Dr. Klem for joining us today. Thank you so much. And hopefully we will invite you back to potentially guest lecture in one of our animal law classes or give another talk. You can pick up a copy of Dr. Klem's book, Solid Air, at your local bookstore, online. Please pick up a copy. I got mine yesterday and I look forward to reading it. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a great day.